You've been useless for years, Ethan. My wife said it clearly enough for every person at the table to hear, and the strange thing was, she did not sound angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger burns hot and disappears. Madison sounded calm, rehearsed, almost relieved, like she had been carrying those words in her purse all evening and had finally found the perfect moment to set them on the table. The dining room went still beneath the amber light of a chandelier that probably cost more than my truck. 12 people sat around Richard Whitmore's polished walnut table, surrounded by crystal glasses, silver serving trays, and family portraits framed in gold. In every photograph, the Whitmores looked like people who had never been told no. Madison sat across from me in a navy dress her mother had chosen for her, one hand resting beside a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front. Her father leaned back in his chair, slowly turning a glass of bourbon between his fingers. Her mother, Patricia, lowered her eyes with the careful expression of a woman pretending she had not been waiting years to hear her daughter say exactly that. Blake, Madison's younger brother, was the first to smile. It started at one corner of his mouth, then spread until he gave a short laugh and looked around the table for permission to enjoy himself. 2 cousins joined him. Then Richard exhaled through his nose, amused but dignified, as if humiliating a man at a birthday dinner required a certain level of class. I looked at Madison. I had known her for 14 years, been married to her for 11, and I could still remember the woman who once sat on the tailgate of my old Ford in the rain, eating cold pizza and telling me she would rather have a real life with me than a perfect life with anyone else. That woman was gone, or maybe she had been buried slowly beneath country club lunches, luxury listings, and Sunday phone calls from a father who measured every man by the size of his office. The woman in front of me did not look away. "I'm tired of defending you," she continued. "I'm tired of making excuses for why you have no ambition, no real career, no plan. Everyone here can see it. You contribute nothing." The word nothing settled over the table heavier than the silence that followed it. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend the restoration projects I had completed, the historic church roof I had spent 6 months rebuilding, or the 80-year-old library windows I had saved from being replaced with plastic. People like Richard did not consider work valuable unless it came with a corner office and a number they could repeat at dinner. I looked down at the fountain pen beside the envelope. Black lacquer, gold trim, Richard's pen. He had placed it there before I arrived, which told me this dinner had never been about his 65th birthday. The cake in the kitchen, the expensive wine, the relatives invited from out of town, all of it was scenery. I was the event. The envelope was thick enough to hold more than a letter. Madison slid it toward me with 2 fingers. "It's a post-nuptial agreement," she said. "My attorney prepared it. You'll move out within 7 days, and you'll agree not to make a claim against my accounts, the house, or anything my family helped us build." Blake gave another quiet laugh. "Honestly, Ethan, this is generous." I looked at him, then at Richard. "And if I don't sign?" Richard finally set down his drink. Then we stopped being polite. His voice was soft, confident, the voice of a man accustomed to watching other people fold. "Madison has carried you long enough. Take the offer, keep what dignity you have left, and move on. Keep what dignity you have left." I felt my thumb move across the worn leather strap of the watch on my wrist. It had belonged to my grandfather, Samuel Caldwell. The face was scratched, the second hand slightly crooked, but it kept perfect time. 5:17. Jonathan had said everything would be final at 5. Madison mistook my silence for defeat. I saw it in the way her shoulders loosened. Patricia reached for her wine. Richard gave the smallest nod toward the pen. Around me, the family waited for the useless man to sign himself out of their lives. Then the doorbell rang. Nobody moved at first. The sound traveled through the house, clean and sharp, cutting through the soft music coming from the living room. Richard frowned. "Are we expecting someone?" I placed my wedding ring beside the pen. Madison's eyes dropped to it, and for the first time that evening, her confidence flickered. "I am," I said. Footsteps crossed the marble foyer. The housekeeper opened the front door, and a man's voice answered, low and professional. I kept my eyes on my wife. She thought the person outside had come to witness my surrender. She had no idea he was carrying 40 million reasons she was wrong. 3 hours earlier, I had been standing in my workshop with sawdust on my sleeves when Jonathan Reed called and told me the last signature was in place. The afternoon sun came through the west window in long gold bars, catching the dust in the air and turning the room almost peaceful. On the workbench in front of me sat a century-old church window I had been restoring one piece at a time. Blue glass, amber glass, thin strips of lead waiting to be fitted back together. I remember looking at it while Jonathan spoke, thinking how strange it was that broken things could still look beautiful when the light passed through them. "The dispute is over," he said. His voice was steady, but I could hear satisfaction beneath it. "The court accepted the final settlement this morning. The trustees signed at 4:42. At 5 o'clock, full control transfers to you." I wiped my hand on a shop towel and looked at the old clock above the door. 4:51. 9 minutes. I had spent nearly 3 years hearing versions of that promise. One more hearing. One more audit. One more relative objecting to a clause my grandfather had written before he died. Samuel Caldwell had built his estate carefully, but careful did not mean simple. There were warehouses outside Savannah, farmland near Beaufort, commercial property along the coast, investment accounts, bonds, and private shares in companies whose names never appeared on billboards. My grandfather had never lived like a wealthy man. He drove the same pickup for 18 years and repaired his own porch steps until his knees would no longer let him. He believed money should work quietly. He believed the loudest thing about a man should be his character. Jonathan cleared his throat. "There is something else." The updated valuation came in. I waited. $40,327,000. The number landed without sound. No thunder. No music. Just the faint scrape of tree branches against the metal roof. I had known the estate was substantial, but numbers on old statements were different from hearing the final figure spoken aloud. $40 million sounded like a life that belonged to someone else. I looked down at my hands. The knuckles were rough. A thin line of blue paint ran beneath one thumbnail. Nothing about me had changed in that second, yet everything around me had acquired a different meaning. The workshop was no longer simply the place where I earned a living. It was a place I had chosen. The truck outside was not the best vehicle I could afford. It was the one I wanted to keep. Even the silence of the last few years felt different. It had not been poverty. It had been restraint. "Does Madison know the final value?" Jonathan asked. No. There was a pause on the line. He had asked me that question before, though never so directly. "Ethan, the legal restrictions are ending. You are free to tell her now." I watched the second hand move toward 5. "I know. Are you going to?" I thought about the cream-colored envelope I had seen half-hidden in Madison's desk 2 nights earlier. I thought about the message that had flashed across her phone that morning from her father. "Tonight needs to be final." I had not opened the envelope. I had not searched her phone. I had spent 11 years trusting that my wife would speak to me before she made a decision that could end our marriage. But trust does not prevent a man from noticing when every door in his own house begins closing softly. "Not yet," I said. "We are having dinner with her family tonight. Richard's birthday. That is what they are calling it." Jonathan went quiet again. He knew the Whitmores. He had reviewed their development contracts during the estate dispute and had warned me more than once that Richard treated kindness like an invitation to negotiate. "What do you think the dinner is really about?" he asked. I looked at the old church window on my bench. One section had been repaired badly decades earlier. The wrong glass had been forced into the frame, and the pressure had spread cracks into 3 neighboring pieces. From a distance, it looked intact. Up close, the damage was obvious. "I think Madison is going to ask me to leave," I said. Saying it aloud should have hurt more than it did. Maybe pain becomes quieter when you have been carrying it long enough. Jonathan did not offer false comfort. That was one reason I trusted him. "Do you want me there?" he asked. I watched the clock reach 5. Somewhere, in an office miles away, my name became the controlling name on every document my grandfather had protected. Nothing in the workshop moved. Nothing announced it. The world simply shifted beneath my feet. "Come to the Whitmore house at 7:30, I said. "Bring the trust documents, the property schedule, and the final valuation. That is everything." "I know. And if the dinner is innocent?" I almost smiled. "Then you can wish Richard a happy birthday and go home." Jonathan let out a slow breath. "And if it is not?" I picked up the small piece of blue glass from the bench and held it toward the light. A hairline crack ran through the center, nearly invisible until the sun touched it. "Then I need to know what tonight is really about before anyone learns what I am worth." By 5:15, I had locked the workshop, washed the dust from my hands, and changed into the same charcoal shirt Madison once told me made me look dependable. That word had meant something different when she first said it. Back then, dependable was a compliment. Lately, it sounded like a polite substitute for ordinary. I stepped outside and pulled the metal door shut behind me. My Ford sat beneath a live oak at the edge of the gravel drive, faded blue paint, one dent above the rear wheel, and 212,000 miles on the odometer. Richard hated that truck. He once offered to help me lease something more appropriate, which was his way of saying he did not want it parked in front of his house. I thanked him and changed the subject. The truck had belonged to my father before it belonged to me. It started every morning, hauled lumber without complaint, and never asked anyone to pretend it was more than it was. I respected that. The drive home took 20 minutes along narrow roads lined with marsh grass and old houses raised on brick foundations. Charleston light has a way of softening everything near sunset. White porches turned gold. Church steeples caught the last bright edge of the sky. Tourists walked slowly beneath palmetto trees, believing the city had preserved itself by accident. I knew better. Old things survive because somebody climbed a ladder, removed the rot, matched the grain, and did the work nobody noticed once it was finished. That was how I had spent most of my adult life. I restored what other people were ready to replace. Houses, windows, doors. For a long time, I believed I was doing the same thing with my marriage. Our home stood on a quiet street west of the Ashley River, a two-story brick house with black shutters and a magnolia tree in the front yard. Madison liked to tell people her commission from a luxury waterfront sale had paid the down payment. She never mentioned that my grandfather had given us the land beneath it as a wedding gift through one of his holding companies. I never corrected her. At the time, the difference seemed unimportant. A marriage was not supposed to be a scoreboard. I parked beside Madison's white sport utility vehicle and noticed her rear door was open. Garment bags hung inside. 2 boxes of shoes sat on the driveway. She had spent most of the afternoon choosing what to wear for her father's birthday, although she had told me dinner would be casual. Through the front window, I could see her moving between the living room and the stairs with her phone pressed to her ear. She turned when I entered, ended the call, and gave me a quick look from my boots to my collar. "You are wearing that?" she asked. "I just changed into it." "I know." She adjusted one of her earrings in the hallway mirror. "I only meant that everyone else will be dressed up." Everyone else. Those 2 words had become a border in our house. On one side stood Madison and her family. On the other stood me. I went upstairs without arguing. Our bedroom looked less like a shared room than it had a year earlier. Her things occupied the dresser, the chair, the vanity, and most of the closet. Mine fit into one narrow section near the bathroom door. I changed into a navy jacket and left the tie behind. When I came downstairs, Madison was standing beside the kitchen island reading a message. She turned the phone face down when she saw me. "Who was that?" I asked. "My mother." "Is everything all right?" "She is stressed about dinner." Her answer came too quickly. I looked at the phone, then at her. She picked up her purse. "Can we please not make tonight difficult?" I was not planning to. "Good." She walked toward the door, then stopped. "And Ethan, when my father asks about work, do not go into the whole window restoration explanation. Just say business is steady." I almost asked why the truth embarrassed her. Instead, I watched her leave. After the front door closed, the house settled into a silence that felt borrowed. I went back through the kitchen, opened the door to the garage, and crossed to the small storage room behind my workbench. Madison had never shown much interest in that room. To her, it held old tools, paint cans, and things I refused to throw away. I moved a stack of cedar boards, lifted a loose section of flooring, and exposed the steel door beneath it. The safe was not large. It held no stacks of cash, no jewelry, nothing dramatic. Inside were letters from my grandfather, copies of trust documents, property maps, and an old brass key wrapped in a blue cloth. I took out Samuel's final letter and ran my thumb across his handwriting. "Ethan," it began, "never let money answer a question that character should answer first." I had read that sentence so many times I no longer needed the paper. I returned the letter, locked the safe, and replaced the boards. Then I turned off the garage light and stood in the darkness for 1 second longer than necessary. The Whitmores believed they knew exactly who I was. A man with an old truck, a modest business, and no ambition large enough to impress them. What they did not understand was that Simplicity had never been forced on me. It was a decision. And that night, for the first time, I was beginning to wonder whether keeping that decision private had protected my marriage or quietly helped destroy it. On the drive to the Whitmore house, I passed the old gas station where Madison and I had first spoken for longer than 5 minutes. It had been 13 years earlier, late in October, when the air in Charleston finally cooled enough to leave the truck windows open. I had stopped there after a full day repairing storm damage at a church outside Mount Pleasant. My boots were covered in plaster dust, my shirt had a tear near one elbow, and my hands smelled like cedar and mineral spirits. Madison was standing beside a red sedan with the hood raised, holding her phone in one hand and staring at the engine as if it had personally offended her. She wore a cream blouse, dark jeans, and heels that sank slightly into the gravel every time she shifted her weight. I had seen her once before at a neighborhood fundraiser, surrounded by polished people who spoke about property values and private schools. She had looked completely at home among them. At the gas station, she looked stranded. I parked beside her and asked if she needed help. She looked at my clothes, then at my truck, and smiled. Not the careful smile she used with clients years later. A real one. "Do you know anything about cars?" she asked. "Enough to know the hood is not supposed to smoke." She laughed, and that laugh stayed with me. The problem was a cracked coolant hose. I wrapped it well enough to get her to a repair shop and followed her there to make sure the engine did not overheat. She bought me coffee from a place across the street while we waited. We sat on the tailgate of my truck, drinking from paper cups as traffic moved past us. She asked what I did for a living. I told her I repaired old buildings. She asked whether that meant construction. I told her it meant listening to things that could not speak. She raised an eyebrow. Buildings talk. All the time. Cracks, leaks, warped floors. Most damage starts quietly. She looked at me for a moment, then said, "That might be the most interesting answer anyone has ever given me." For our first date, I took her to a small seafood place near Shem Creek. I apologized because the restaurant was crowded and my reservation had disappeared from their book. Madison did not complain. We walked to a food stand instead, bought shrimp baskets, and ate outside while boats moved through the dark water. She slipped off her shoes and rested her feet on the bench. When I told her my grandfather owned several properties along the coast, she did not ask how much they were worth. She asked whether he had taught me how to repair things. That was the Madison I fell in love with. She liked stopping at roadside produce stands. She kept a blanket in my truck for evenings near the water. She said expensive restaurants made her nervous because everyone seemed afraid to enjoy the food. She used to visit my workshop on Saturdays with iced coffee and sit on a stool while I worked. Dust would settle on her hair and shoulders, and she never cared. Once, while I was restoring a pair of oak doors from an old courthouse, she traced the grain with one finger and said, "I like that you save things people have given up on." I remember turning toward her with a chisel in my hand, thinking no one had ever understood me so quickly. Her family did not approve of me from the beginning. Richard asked about my income before he asked about my parents. Patricia wanted to know whether restoration work included health insurance. Blake joked that I was one recession away from living in my truck. Madison defended me then. At her parents' anniversary dinner, when Richard suggested she could do better, she put down her fork and said, "I am not marrying a resume. I am marrying a man." I loved her for that sentence. I built years of trust around it. When we married, we did not have a ballroom or a string quartet. We held the ceremony in a restored chapel beneath live oaks, with 80 guests and folding chairs on the grass. Madison wore her mother's veil. I wore my grandfather's watch. Afterward, rain swept in from the harbor and soaked the reception tent. The band lost power. The tablecloths blew sideways. Madison grabbed my hand and pulled me into the rain. We danced without music while our families watched from beneath the tent. Her dress collected mud at the hem. Her hair fell loose around her face. She laughed like nothing in the world could embarrass her. For years, I believed that moment told me everything I needed to know about our marriage. I believed she would always choose what was real over what looked impressive. Change did not arrive all at once. It came in small corrections. She stopped visiting the workshop because the dust ruined her clothes. She asked me to park behind restaurants when we met her clients. She replaced the furniture we had chosen together because it looked too rustic. At first, I called it success. Then I called it growth. By the time I understood it was shame, it had already learned how to speak with her voice. The road curved toward the Whitmore neighborhood, where stone walls hid wide lawns, and every mailbox matched the house behind it. Madison's sport utility vehicle was several car lengths ahead of me. She did not slow down to see whether I was following. I watched her turn through her parents' iron gates and remembered the woman who once sat beside me on a truck tailgate, smiling at the dust on my boots. I did not know exactly when I had lost her. I only knew the woman waiting at the end of that driveway had begun treating the life we built together like something she needed to apologize for. The iron gates closed behind my truck with a soft mechanical hum, and for a moment I sat beneath the long shadows of the live oaks, watching warm light spill from the Whitmore windows. Before I stepped out, my eyes went to the watch on my wrist. Samuel had given it to me on my 21st birthday, along with the first rule he ever taught me about money. Never use it to make people small. He had built his fortune without ever calling it one. To him, wealth was land that stayed productive, buildings that remained useful, workers who received their pay on Friday, and families who could sleep without wondering whether the bank would take their home. He started with a single warehouse near the river after serving in the Navy, then added another when business improved. Over 4 decades, he bought neglected commercial buildings, repaired them, and leased them to local companies at fair rates. He invested in freight, timber, municipal bonds, and farmland, but he never spoke about returns at dinner. He spoke about responsibility. When I was 12, he took me to one of his oldest properties after a tropical storm had damaged the roof. Water had run down the walls and ruined several offices. I expected him to call contractors and leave. Instead, he handed me a broom. We spent the day helping tenants move furniture and cover equipment. That evening, I asked why a man who owned the building was sweeping floors. He looked at me as if the answer should have been obvious. Ownership does not place you above the work, he said. It places you closer to the consequences. That sentence stayed with me longer than any number in the estate documents. Samuel distrusted people who announced their wealth before anyone asked. He had seen money turn ordinary insecurity into arrogance. He had also seen relatives appear at hospital beds with concern in their voices and calculations behind their eyes. So he built the Caldwell Trust with patience and caution. The assets would pass to me only after a series of conditions had been satisfied. Debts had to be cleared. Properties had to be independently valued. A disputed partnership had to be dissolved. Every beneficiary challenge had to reach a legal conclusion. Until then, I could receive a modest distribution, but I could not control the principal, sell major assets, or publicly represent myself as the owner. Jonathan advised me to speak carefully, especially while Samuel's nephew, Charles, challenged the trust in court. One careless statement could become evidence that I had influenced my grandfather or concealed information. At first, keeping the estate private felt like simple legal discipline. Then it became habit. Later, it became something harder to admit. I wanted to know whether Madison would still see me when there was no impressive number attached to my name. That was not entirely fair. She had married me without knowing the full value of the trust, but she had known my grandfather owned property. I had never lied when she asked direct questions. I told her the estate was tied up. I told her the outcome was uncertain. I told her I intended to continue working no matter what happened. What I did not tell her was that Jonathan's earliest estimate had already placed my eventual share above $30 million. I told myself silence protected us from greed. Some nights, lying beside her while she slept with her back toward me, I wondered whether it had become a test she did not know she was taking. A man can call his silence patience when he is afraid of the answer waiting on the other side of a conversation. I should have told her more, not because she had earned access to every private document, but because marriage was supposed to be the one place where uncertainty was shared. Instead, I let her believe my work was all we had. I watched her grow embarrassed by my truck, my clothes, and my small workshop. I waited for her to remember the man she had chosen. Each time she failed, I withdrew a little further. That was my part in what happened between us. I did not create her contempt, but I gave it room to grow without forcing it into the light. The front door opened before I reached the steps. Patricia stood there in a pale blue dress, pearls at her throat, her smile prepared in advance. Her eyes moved past me toward the driveway, checking whether I had brought anything more respectable than my Ford. "Ethan," she said. We were beginning to wonder. I checked my watch. 6:58. We were 2 minutes early. Traffic was light, I said. She stepped aside and let me enter. The foyer smelled of polished wood, gardenias, and the roast cooking somewhere beyond the dining room. Family voices drifted through the house, bright and practiced. Madison stood near the fireplace with Richard and Blake. When she saw me, she did not smile. Richard glanced at my jacket, then at my boots, as though confirming a prediction. On a narrow table beside the dining room entrance sat a cream-colored envelope and a black fountain pen. My name was written across the front. I felt the truth of the evening settle into place. Samuel had taught me that money revealed character. Standing in that foyer, surrounded by people who believed I had none, I understood that before the night was over, it would reveal mine as well. Patricia led me into the living room as if I were a guest she had forgotten to remove from the invitation list. Richard stood near the fireplace with one hand in his pocket, telling a story about a hotel project outside Hilton Head. Blake listened with the expression he always wore when his father talked business, eager and slightly rehearsed. Madison held a glass of white wine and looked past me toward the hallway. No one asked how my day had been. That was not unusual anymore. I moved toward the side table, where framed photographs showed the Whitmores on ski trips, golf courses, and charity stages. I appeared in only 2 of them, both near the edge. Patricia offered me a drink. I asked for water. Blake smiled. Still keeping things simple, Ethan? Water usually works. That is kind of your whole philosophy, is it not? His tone was light enough to deny the insult if anyone challenged him. No one did. Richard turned from the fireplace. Madison tells us your business has been slow. I looked at her. She took a sip of wine. I said it has been inconsistent. Restoration work is seasonal, I said. The church project is almost complete, and I start a courthouse job next month. Richard nodded as if I had confirmed something disappointing. Small jobs keep a man occupied. They do not build security. The work matters to the people who use those buildings. People say that when the numbers are not impressive. Blake laughed into his glass. Patricia touched Richard's sleeve and said, "It is your birthday. Let us not turn this into a business seminar." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes stayed on me. Besides, Ethan has never been motivated by the same things we are. I had heard versions of that sentence for years. At first, it sounded almost respectful. Then the meaning became clear. They did not think I had different values. They thought I lacked the ability to reach theirs. We moved into the dining room at 7:10. The table was set for 12, with white roses in a low silver bowl and place cards written in Patricia's careful handwriting. Mine was between Blake and a cousin named Trevor who sold medical equipment and spoke about quarterly bonuses before the first course arrived. Madison sat across from me beside her father. The cream-colored envelope remained on the narrow table near the doorway. Every few minutes, her eyes moved toward it. Dinner began with crab soup and small talk. Richard described plans for a luxury condominium development near the river. Trevor congratulated Blake on a recent promotion. Patricia praised Madison for closing a waterfront property above asking price. When the conversation reached me, it did not arrive as a question. "Ethan is still working with old windows," Patricia said to an aunt from Virginia. "Historic preservation," I corrected. "Of course," she replied. "He has always been very patient with things that have outlived their usefulness." The aunt looked down at her spoon. Blake did not. He smiled openly. Madison heard the remark. She rearranged her napkin. That was how it happened most often. Not with one cruel sentence, but with 100 small permissions. Her mother would make a comment. Her brother would turn it into a joke. Her father would add a lesson about ambition. Madison would say nothing. Then, later at home, she would ask why I had been so quiet, as though my silence were the problem. I remembered the first time she introduced me to a new group of clients without mentioning my work. "Ethan is taking some time to figure out his next move," she had said. I was standing beside her with 3 active contracts and a waiting list stretching into spring. In the car, I asked why she said it. She stared through the windshield and answered, "Restoration does not sound substantial to people like them." People like them. The phrase stayed with me. Months later, she asked me to park behind a restaurant during a dinner with one of her developers because the rust above my rear wheel might create the wrong impression. I told her I would meet her there another time. She called me stubborn. I called it nothing. That was my mistake. I kept turning injuries into silence until silence became the language of our marriage. Halfway through the main course, Richard set down his fork. "A man should know where he is going by 43. The table quieted. He looked directly at me. You have been given every opportunity to make something larger of yourself. Larger according to whom? I asked. His expression tightened. According to the responsibilities of marriage. Madison finally spoke. Please do not start. She was looking at me, not at him. I asked one question. You always do this, she said. You make everyone explain basic reality to you, then act offended. A faint pressure gathered beneath my ribs, but my voice stayed even. What reality? Blake leaned back and crossed his arms. That Madison has carried the financial weight for years. That is not true. Then tell us what you earned last year, Richard said. The question hung above the table. I could have answered. I could have explained that my business had cleared more than enough to support our household even before Madison's commissions. I could have told them the mortgage payments they credited to her had often come from my account. But facts would not have changed the evening. Their conclusion had been chosen before I arrived. Madison looked at the envelope again. Then Richard followed her eyes. He folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. Perhaps we should stop circling the reason everyone is here. The room became very still. Patricia lowered her glass. Blake's smile returned. Madison reached beneath the table, clasped her hands for a moment, then stood. She crossed to the doorway and picked up the cream-colored envelope. When she turned back toward me, her face had the careful calm of someone stepping into a speech she had practiced alone. She laid the envelope beside my plate. The black fountain pen followed. We need to talk about what happens next, she said. Madison remained standing while everyone else stayed seated, and that arrangement told me more than her opening sentence did. She had the room. Her father had the table. I had a sealed envelope and a pen placed close enough to suggest the decision had already been made for me. I looked at her face, searching for some sign that this was still a conversation between a husband and wife. I found preparation instead. Her breathing was controlled. Her shoulders were square. Even the distance between us felt measured. I have spent months trying to make this work, she said. I have asked you to change. I have asked you to think about our future. Nothing changes. I kept my hands on the table. You have not asked me to leave. I am asking now. The words came softly, almost gently, which made them colder. Patricia lowered her eyes as if the moment pained her. Richard did not bother pretending. He watched me with the patient satisfaction of a man seeing a plan move exactly as expected. Blake leaned toward the envelope. You should read it, he said. Nobody asked you, I replied. His smile faded for half a second, then returned. Madison pushed the envelope closer. I opened it and removed a stack of papers held together with a brass clip. The first page carried the letterhead of a family law firm downtown. The language was clean, expensive, and designed to look reasonable. Voluntary post-nuptial agreement. Mutual understanding. Equitable separation of interests. Legal language has a way of dressing fear in a suit. I turned the page. The first condition required me to leave our home within 7 days and establish a separate residence. The second stated that I would waive any claim to Madison's business income, retirement accounts, investments, and future earnings. The third released any interest I might have in the house or in property she described as having been acquired through Whitmore family assistance. I read that sentence twice. The land beneath our house had come from my grandfather. The earliest mortgage payments had come from my account. The kitchen renovation Madison proudly credited to a large commission had been paid for with money from a Caldwell trust distribution. None of that appeared in the document. At the bottom of the final page, the agreement offered me $25,000 as a one-time settlement, provided I signed before leaving the table. I looked up. Tonight. Madison nodded. It is cleaner this way. Cleaner for whom? Richard answered for her. For everyone. I placed the papers back in order. You expect me to sign a legal agreement at a dinner table without independent counsel. You have had years to prepare for the consequences of your choices, he said. Do not pretend this is sudden. It became sudden when you put a pen beside my plate. Patricia reached toward me with one hand, stopping before she touched my sleeve. Ethan, no one is trying to embarrass you. I looked around at the relatives who had been invited to watch. Some studied their plates. Others watched openly. Then why are there 12 people in the room? Her hand withdrew. Madison sat down again, but she did not take the chair across from me. She moved to the one beside her father. That small choice completed the picture. I wanted support, she said. You wanted witnesses. I knew you would make this difficult. I have not raised my voice. That is what you do, she replied. You stay calm and force everyone else to look unreasonable. For years, my silence had made her uncomfortable because it left space for her own words to echo. I had once mistaken that discomfort for reflection. It was not. She wanted resistance she could point to, an outburst she could use as proof that the evening was necessary. Richard folded his hands. The offer is generous. You leave the house, take your tools, keep your truck, and start over. Madison moves forward without further financial damage. Financial damage? I asked. Your lifestyle has been subsidized long enough. The sentence was so detached from reality that it almost sounded rehearsed. I glanced at Madison. Did you tell them I do not contribute to our expenses? She looked toward the centerpiece. This is not about individual payments. Did you tell them I do not contribute? You are avoiding the larger issue. That is not an answer. Her jaw tightened. Richard stepped in before she had to respond. This family is not putting Madison on trial. No, I said. You brought me here for that. Nobody spoke. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passing seconds with a quiet mechanical click. I thought about the message on Madison's phone that morning, the envelope in her desk, and Jonathan asking what the dinner was really about. Now I knew. This was not an impulsive decision made after an argument. They had chosen the lawyer, drafted the terms, invited the audience, and placed the pin before I walked through the door. They had counted on pressure doing what fairness could not. I turned to the last page and studied the empty signature line. Beside it, Madison's name had already been signed and dated. Her handwriting looked familiar, but the certainty behind it did not. How long have you been planning this? I asked. She hesitated. Blake answered before she could. Long enough. Richard gave him a warning glance, but the damage was done. I closed the agreement and rested my palm on top of it. Madison finally met my eyes. Sign it, Ethan. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. I looked at the woman who had once danced with me in the rain, then at the family gathered around her like a wall she had chosen to stand behind. They believed the papers had reduced my life to a truck, some tools, and $25,000. They believed the man at the table had nowhere else to go. What they did not know was that at 5 o'clock that afternoon, every assumption in the room had expired. Madison watched me study the signature line, and the patience in her face began to thin. This is exactly what I mean, she said. Everything has to become a performance with you. I looked up from the agreement. I have said almost nothing. That is the performance. You sit there quietly and make everyone feel guilty for telling the truth. Richard shifted in his chair, encouraged by the opening. Your wife has spent years covering for you, Ethan. She has explained your lack of progress to friends, clients, and this family. She should not have to keep doing that. Covering for me? Do not twist the words, Madison said. You know what he means. I didn't know what he meant. He meant the dinners where Madison introduced my work as a hobby. He meant the real estate events where she asked me not to discuss restoration because investors preferred people with scalable careers. He meant the Christmas party where Blake joked that I was one antique window away from retirement. And Madison laughed because correcting him would have made the room uncomfortable. The Whitmores had built a version of me that required no evidence. They repeated it until even Madison began speaking as if it were fact. I closed the agreement and slid it 2 inches away from me. I will have my attorney review it. Richard gave a short laugh. With what attorney? A few people looked down, but Blake smiled without restraint. Madison pressed her fingertips against the table. Please do not turn this into another delay. Having legal counsel review a legal agreement is not a delay. You always find a reason not to act. I came here for a birthday dinner. You brought separation papers. Her eyes hardened. Because talking to you privately never leads anywhere. You never mentioned separation privately. I mentioned being unhappy. That is not the same conversation. Patricia sighed softly, the sound of someone inconvenienced by details. Madison has been unhappy for a long time. Surely you noticed. I noticed the separate calendars. I noticed the closed office door. I noticed the way Madison stopped asking about my work unless someone else was listening. I noticed every inch that opened between us. What I had not noticed was the moment she decided to fill that distance with lawyers and witnesses. I noticed, I said. Then why did you do nothing? Madison asked. The question carried years inside it. For 1 second, the room disappeared, and I saw the two of us in our kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, both waiting for the other person to say what mattered. I could have answered honestly. I could have told her I kept hoping the woman who once chose me without conditions would come back. I could have admitted that I stayed silent because every conversation had begun to feel like an evaluation. But the family around us had not gathered to hear the truth. They had gathered to approve a verdict. I kept working, I said. I kept paying my share. I kept showing up. Madison laughed once, without humor. Showing up is not enough. It used to be. That sentence reached her. I saw it in the brief movement around her eyes. Then Richard leaned toward her, and the moment closed. Do not let him redirect this, he said. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. When she looked at me again, her voice was colder. Fine. Let us be direct. You have no ambition that anyone can see. You have no meaningful savings. You drive a truck that should have been replaced years ago. You spend your days repairing buildings no one else wants. Then act morally superior because you do not care about money. Each sentence arrived cleanly, like items checked from a list. I have defended that life for years. I am done defending it. I glanced around the table. Patricia looked solemn. Blake looked entertained. Richard looked proud. Madison had chosen her audience carefully because she needed their expressions to hold her steady. What exactly are you saying? I asked, though I already knew. She drew a slow breath. I am saying you have contributed nothing to the future I have been trying to build. Nothing. Nothing that matters. The room held still. Even Blake stopped smiling for a moment. Madison looked directly at me and said the word she had been walking toward all evening. You are useless, Ethan. You have been for years. The sentence landed more quietly than I expected. There was no explosion inside me. No sudden anger. Just a door closing somewhere deep in my chest. I remembered her in the rain, laughing with mud on her dress. I remembered her asleep beside me in our first apartment while traffic moved beyond the window. I remembered every time I had chosen patience because I believed love could survive embarrassment. Then Blake laughed. One cousin joined him. Richard lifted his glass. Patricia lowered her eyes. Madison did not take the words back. I looked at the fountain pen, then at my wedding ring. Slowly, I removed the ring and placed it beside the unsigned agreement. The soft click against the table silenced the room. Madison stared at it. What are you doing? Listening, I said. For once, I am hearing exactly what you think of me. Do not be dramatic. I am not. I checked my grandfather's watch. 7:29. Jonathan was early, or exactly on time by his standards. I heard tires move across the gravel outside, then stop near the front steps. Richard frowned toward the hallway. I rested both hands on the table and looked at Madison. Before I sign anything, there is someone you should meet. The doorbell rang. The doorbell sounded a second time before anyone moved. Patricia looked toward the hallway, irritated by the interruption. Richard remained seated, but his expression changed. He did not like surprises in his own house. The housekeeper crossed the foyer, and a moment later, I heard the front door open. Jonathan Reed stepped into the dining room carrying a black leather briefcase in one hand and a slim document case in the other. He wore a dark gray suit, a white shirt, and the same restrained expression he brought into courtrooms, estate meetings, and difficult conversations. Nothing about him was theatrical. That was why he was effective. He did not need to raise his voice to make people listen. Richard stood. Can I help you? Jonathan looked at him, then at me. I am here at Mr. Caldwell's request. Blake glanced at Madison. Patricia's mouth tightened. Madison looked from Jonathan to the agreement beside my plate. Ethan, what is this? Independent counsel, I said. Richard gave a dismissive laugh. You brought an attorney to a family dinner? Jonathan set the briefcase on an empty chair. Mr. Caldwell asked me to attend at 7:30. I arrived at 7:29. His eyes moved to the papers in front of me. I assume those are the documents you mentioned. I handed him the agreement. He read the first page in silence, then turned through the remaining pages with practiced speed. The only sound in the room was paper moving beneath his fingers. When he reached the signature page, he paused. You were expected to sign this tonight? That was the request, I said. Jonathan looked at Madison. Without separate legal review? She shifted in her chair. It was meant to be straightforward. Documents are often described that way by the party who drafted them. Richard stepped forward. This does not concern you. Jonathan closed the agreement. It concerns my client. The word client changed the room. Until that moment, the Whitmores had treated me like a man with no structure. Behind him, no preparation, no one standing beside him. Jonathan's presence gave shape to something they had refused to imagine. Richard folded his arms. Then review it and leave. This is a private family matter. Jonathan did not respond immediately. He opened the black briefcase and removed a blue folder sealed with a silver clasp. Then he placed a second folder beside it, followed by a thick property schedule, a valuation report, and several certified documents bearing embossed stamps. The stack looked almost modest compared with the weight it carried. Madison's eyes moved across the papers. "What are those?" she asked. Jonathan looked at me once, waiting. I nodded. He turned back to the table. At 5 o'clock this afternoon, the final conditions of the Samuel Caldwell Irrevocable Estate Trust were satisfied. All pending beneficiary objections were dismissed, the contested partnership was dissolved, and controlling authority transferred to Ethan Caldwell. No one spoke. Richard's face remained composed, but the hand at his side tightened around the stem of his glass. Blake looked confused. Patricia glanced toward Madison as if expecting her to explain. Madison did not. Her eyes stayed on Jonathan. "Transferred what?" she asked. Jonathan opened the valuation report. "The trust holds commercial real estate, agricultural land, municipal bonds, private equity interests, cash reserves, and controlling shares in several operating companies." He spoke without emphasis, which made every word feel heavier. "The independently assessed value as of this afternoon is $40,327,000. The room did not react all at once. First came stillness. Then disbelief moved across the table in small physical signs. Trevor stopped with his hand halfway to his glass. Patricia's lips parted, but no words came. Blake's smile disappeared completely. Richard lowered himself back into his chair. Madison stared at Jonathan as though he had begun speaking a language she should have understood, but did not. "That cannot be right," she said. Jonathan turned one page toward her. The valuation was completed by two separate firms. The figures differ by less than 1%. Ethan never said anything about $40 million. "The estate was under active litigation," Jonathan replied. "Public disclosure was restricted, and control was uncertain until today." Madison looked at me. "You knew?" I knew the range. Her face changed, not yet with regret, but with the shock of realizing how incomplete her picture of me had been. For how long? Long enough to know the money was not available to me. Not legally. Not practically. Richard recovered first. Men like him often do. He leaned forward and searched for an angle that could restore his position. A trust is not the same as personal wealth. He may not have direct access. Jonathan opened the blue folder. As of 5 o'clock, he has full administrative authority, voting control, distribution rights, and the power to appoint or remove asset managers within the terms of the trust. He slid the certification across the table. "This is not a future possibility. It is current authority." Richard did not touch the document. Madison did. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the first page. I watched her eyes move over my full legal name, the effective date, and the list of powers granted to me. The same hand that had pushed a $25,000 settlement toward me now rested on proof that she had never understood the financial reality of our marriage. "Why did you let me believe we were struggling?" she asked. "We were not struggling. You let me think everything depended on me. Everything did not depend on you. That is not what it felt like. Because you stopped asking questions and started accepting your family's answers." The sentence reached her more deeply than the number had. She looked down. Jonathan placed the post-nuptial agreement beside his documents. "There is also a practical issue with the terms you were asked to sign. The house identified here as property acquired through Whitmore Family Assistance was built on land transferred from a Caldwell holding company. Several major improvements were funded through documented distributions from the trust. The agreement mischaracterizes both ownership history and contribution." Patricia turned toward Richard. "Did you know that?" He ignored her. His attention remained fixed on Jonathan. "What exactly does Ethan own?" Jonathan closed the valuation report halfway. "That answer is longer than this dinner. But there is one item you will find particularly relevant." He reached for the property schedule and placed his finger on a marked line. "Whitmore Development's Rivergate project operates on 42 acres held by Caldwell Coastal Properties, a wholly owned trust entity." Richard's face lost its color. The grandfather clock clicked once in the hallway. Then again. No one laughed. No one moved toward the pen. The man they had invited to sign away his future was now the legal authority behind the grounds supporting their largest one.